Welcome to today's talk. My name is Giacomin, and today we'll be discussing one of my favorite topics, design for meaning. So first of all, why should designers worry about meaning? What is the reason for prioritizing specifically this topic? What is the reason that we're discussing this today? Well, there's several ways to view it. There's a huge number of things that could be said. We'll just approach it from a couple different points of view to try to give it a sense and explain a little bit why we're prioritizing it. And hopefully by the end of these 4 or 5 points of view, it'll be a bit clear just what a central role meaning plays in just about any artifact that we might design. First point of view, somewhat philosophical, taken in large extent from the work of Csikszentmihalyi, artifacts as facilitators. In 1981, Csikszentmihalyi produced a very influential text called The Meaning of Things. In this text, there's great analysis of values and meanings assigned by groups of people to different artifacts, different parts of their life, and there was an analysis of the cognitive and psychological and other drivers and the philosophical implications behind these expressions of meaning. One point made by Csikszentmihalyi, which is captured here in this particular slide, is this statement which is very clear in outlook. The objects that people use, despite their incredible diversity and sometimes contradictory usage, appear to be signs of a blueprint that represent the relations of people to themselves, to other people that they might encounter, and to the cosmos or universe, to the physical world we live in. So designed artifacts, just like any other object we can find on this planet, designed artifacts are intermediaries. They are facilitators. They are affordances. They are things which come between us and our own scrutinizing of our thinking, because sometimes we might be trying to decide something, we're thinking about that, and we will visualize and imagine certain artifacts, how they would be used and how they might influence the situation, how that affects our decision. Certainly artifacts are commonly used to do things in the world, a shovel to shovel dirt, a pen to write on a sheet of paper. And artifacts are certainly also facilitators or intermediaries between us and other people. Sharing a cup of coffee, sitting down and eating dinner together, operating or communicating over the internet using some email or Zoom or some other tool. So the objects that we design as designers have a great role to play in people's lives and can have very profound effects on how people live their lives. Thus, thinking of the meaning of the artifacts or how they might change the meanings of these relationships is incredibly important from a philosophical point of view. Another point of view, somewhat more commercial, more practical in everyday use, is that of value. The meaning we assign, or the multiple meanings we might assign to some artifact, some product, some system, some service, and the way we go about interacting with it affects our estimation of its value. There are different ways of accounting for value, and here is a particularly complete list which was produced in '94 by Richens. Utilitarian, enjoyment, self-expression, symbolic, appearance, status, spiritual. There are different categories or different possibilities or labels that we can stick on things for saying how they are a type of value, how they, for us, can be a reason for engaging with something, deciding something, or doing something. So the meaning of the artifact definitely leads to it falling into one or more of these categories of value, and thus meaning is incredibly central to the value we then assign to something, whether something's important to us or not important to us, whether we're willing to spend lots of money for it or not. Most or much of that at least comes from the meaning it has for us and the role it plays in our lives. Another point of view on meaning, the very common thing we live, the situation we live every day of our lives. Every time we open up the television or the internet and see a commercial flash in front of us, it's probably based or inspired by the identity message of advertising. There's you as you are today. There's some product, system, or service being offered, and it has some symbolic meanings possibly for you. You purchase that, bring some meanings into your life. It's the new you that you perhaps aspire or wish to be. So the identity message of advertising, the reason for purchasing or engaging with many things in this world, is very much one of aspiration. You identify with something, it has a symbolic meaning, it's of some meaning and value to you, you engage with it, and hopefully you imagine yourself in a better situation. Meaning is also central to human-centered design. As I've discussed in other talks, meaning is at the very top of the hierarchy. Yes, you can be very good at the human factors in ergonomics. Yes, you can have a product or a service that's excellent in terms of interactivity. And yes, you might even aesthetically, semiotically, symbolically, you might have something very rich and very rewarding. But all of this will be to no avail if the artifact, the product, system, or service does not have a meaning and thus also a value for the person which is sufficient for them to engage with it. So meaning is definitely an ultimate goal of much human-centered design. Those are motivations for considering meaning. They're different perspectives, and they're just an introduction to give a flavor as to why this topic comes up over and over and over again in discussions of design. Now the question then becomes, what is meaning? And there's a lot of confusion about that. In the design community, we tend to use the term meaning in a very liberal manner, in many different ways, to apply to many different things, occasionally even in a sloppy manner. So meaning can lead to some confusion, the use of that term. So let's try to clarify what we're referring to exactly in the remaining part of this talk. What we're referring to in this talk is not what's shown here. Semiotic or linguistic meaning, the fact that a word in language or a drawing or a symbol or a piece of art can be taken as a representation of something else. The fact that the word car can be used to refer to this one and to many other ones, that's not the meaning we're talking about. We're not talking about the pure linguistic symbolic meaning. That's a different topic, and that's a different issue. What we're focusing on here is what's much more central to design, which is meaning as a source of value, meaning as a reason that something is significant, meaning as an underlying truth of something, meaning as the motivation or the why of why you think, or hopefully people will, engage with something. So meaning is what it represents to me, what it brings to me, the reason I think it has value for me. It's the driver, the intention, the motivation, the set of ideas which makes things simpler and clearer to me that lead me to engage with the artifact in the first place. Now, meaning is a topic that's been debated for several millennia amongst philosophers, linguists, scientists, sociologists, psychologists. It's a subject which is very important and very complex. Now, there are a few points of general agreement. There's a few positions which most people would use in their discussions and take in reference to some of their decision making and some of their points. One position of where does meaning come from is the objectivist approach, or the objectivist philosophy, or the objectivist point of view, which is that the world is full of stuff, and the stuff can be perceived through your senses, and knowledge can be obtained through your senses about this stuff, and those things have meaning on their own. You can find that a stone drops to the ground, and that dropping and maybe breaking is a type of action, and it has some implications and thus a meaning. So the objectivist point of view is that meanings, at least a large number of them, if not all of them, are certainly out there in the world, and they can be grasped, and they can be considered to some degree universals. Another point of view, which developed slightly more recent times perhaps, is the constructivist point of view, which is somewhat the opposite to some degree, which is that meanings are largely constructed by people. Meanings are when people, in their talking and their acting and their living together and interacting together, when people come to some degree of agreement that something is defined by this, and something has this nature, and something probably has this value to everyone in the community. So the constructivist point of view is somewhat the opposite. It's saying actually the universe, the cosmos out there, is not really that obvious that there's things that have meaning. It's not really that obvious what we should be applying meaning to or what value it might have. It's there, it needs addressing, it has to be dealt with, but the way we go about addressing it, the words we use to call it, the importance we give it personally or in our community, is something that is the result of an agreement or a social contract or some sort of community behavior that emerges amongst people. So we have two basic sources of the meanings, and then there's a question of, well, what types might they be? Whether you agree with the constructivists, or whether you agree with their opposite, whether you compromise and say it's a bit of both, there's still a question of what are the types of meaning, because as designers we're very pragmatic and we wish to be clear in our talking, clear in our specifying, and clear in our designing. Which types of meanings are we going to target for our design? Is one type going to be given a little bit more priority and emphasis in our decision making than another? Is one type going to be tested more than another by our design artifact? Now the types of meanings, lots of work over the years in that area. I myself have done quite a bit and written some papers on the topic. If you review the literature from the last couple of millennia, philosophy, linguistics, psychology, sociology, science, engineering, you find that there is some degree of consensus at a very high level of understanding. So if we talk about the basic nature of the type of meaning, we find some things repeating themselves over and over in the different disciplines, using occasionally slightly different terms or different words, but referring to the same general metaphor, the same pattern of thinking. And you find three macro categories. You can then subdivide them quite a lot. You can then see out there in the real world lots of artifacts which are mixtures of the three basic categories. It's not necessary that a design only sign up, as it were, to one type of meaning. You can have multiple meanings for the same artifact due to different characteristics it might have. But from a gross generalization point of view, you can definitely find three categories which are somewhat mutually exclusive in their characteristics. The first of them is function. Function, the way something works or operates, its natural purpose, its natural pattern of use. As it says at the bottom of the slide, some things in this life need doing, with or without aesthetics, with or without semiotics, with or without any deep social or psychological or cultural significance to it. The car breaks down, I need to remove the wheel, I'm going to need a tool to loosen the bolts or loosen the nuts of the wheel. So there are things in life which is highly functional in nature, and other considerations, it's not that they don't exist, but they're probably much less important. And the world is full of such artifacts, and we can imagine both products and services that fit this sort of a description, which are largely of this type. For example, on the slide at the moment, you can see hand tools, power tools, you can see industrially produced goods, chairs and automobiles, where the industrial process is highly functional, more so than even the artifact itself. It's producing good quality things which are useful and functional at a very low price, which itself is a form of functional design. Band-aids, an excellent example of design, strips which can be placed immediately on a cut or a wound, and their sizes and shapes have been optimized based on typical statistics and typical findings of what happens to people when they hurt themselves in the home or outside the home. Hand calculators, computers, cell phones, iPads, lots of examples of things which may have several meanings to them, but it's clear there's a dominant, fundamental, central meaning which is of the functional type. And on the left we have the traditional Swiss Army knife, the Victorinox product, classical example of a tool which is designed from a functional or functionalist point of view. I add more tools to my device, it's more useful to more people. It's function as the driver, form follows function, everything else follows function in an artifact of this type. However, as human beings, we're incredibly complex, and we live a very spiritual life, not just a practical, functional life. We don't spend our days just doing things all day long without reasons, motivations, emotions, and engagements with these situations. So there's other forms of meaning where emotions and patterns and behaviors and psychological and sociological considerations come more into play. The first of those is ritual, a series of actions or a type of behavior which is regularly and usually invariably performed by a person or by a group of people or by a whole society. A set of fixed actions, often very bodily, embodied in nature, and these actions send off messages, they say things about us, they communicate, they have some semiotic value to them. So there are rituals a person may perform, such as their morning breakfast tea, or their after lunch coffee, or going out for dinner on a first date to a certain restaurant with someone. There are certain rituals that people will repeat over and over again, and the reason that they're repeating it over and over again is, yes, there's a functional aspect, but it is pleasing, it is enjoying, it is pure enjoyment, there's an experience, and it's saying something about us in the process. The fact that there's 100 different ways to have breakfast, and I choose that one as my way of having breakfast, and I focus on the experience and I enjoy the actual process, that from a ritual perspective is giving us great satisfaction and can quite often be a target for design. And the world around us suggests that there's lots of rituals, and there's a lot of attention to ritual in a lot of design activity. For example, on this slide we have examples of a series of artifacts which are strongly ritualistic in nature. Yes, I could have a good cup of coffee made by any number of a variety of sophisticated machines which are good at making coffee, but there's something special about having a coffee drawn from an Electra. This machine, which was originally from the 19th century, its original design, covered in chrome, covered in brass and bronze, lovely totemic, almost religious looking device. Having a coffee drawn from there is probably very enjoyable, not just in the taste, but also the experience of an artifact like that with all its complexity and its aesthetics being used to draw the coffee. Cosmetics is an industry which pays close attention to semiotics and ritual in people's behaviors and what they wish to express and how they wish to express themselves and what are the best ways they think to go about doing that. Going to a hair salon, not necessary to trim the hair in a place that looks something like a religious cathedral, but the experience of going to a hair salon with a lovely setting, full of mirrors, full of lights, beautiful aesthetics, lovely furniture, buzzing with people, it's all part of the ritual of performing and styling and making oneself better and more attractive and more engageable. Looking at the bottom of the slide, personalization. A human ritual which goes back many millennia. There's artifacts of early man which seem to have symbols and things scratched into it which appear to be forms of personalization, possibly the names of the individuals involved. The jewelry or the luxury industry surrounding jewelry and other products for aesthetic purposes. These products are largely ritualistic in nature, and in the middle of the slide there's a lovely example from a design project of a student of a few years back where we see the English breakfast ritual of the morning toast being optimized, perfected, and taken to a high level by having a device with a laser head which browns and gives a golden color to the toast as it slowly is drawn ever so slowly through the rollers, and you can see your toast slowly dropping down onto the plate below, such that your morning toast as a ritualistic experience is emphasized and augmented and drawn to its biggest possible impact. So here we see just a small sample of the many things around us each day which are designed considering very carefully and in great detail the rituals they are part of, the meanings and semiotics they facilitate, and the role they play in people's lives. And the third macro category, or the third big group of meanings that can be drawn from all the different professions, all the different literatures, is the one we're calling here myth. We're talking about stories. We're talking about narratives. We're talking about ways of understanding life and the world around us. Stories and narratives, they have a beginning, often full of intentions and motivations. They have a middle with some actions and some consequences, and then they have an end which is drawing to a conclusion. There's certain consequences, there's certain outcomes from the whole story as it evolved. So myths, traditional stories, occasionally not really accurate, occasionally inflated, distorted, perfected, purified to a great degree. So they're not realistic historical accounts. They're stories which give us a beginning with motivations, a middle with some actions, and an end with some outcomes. And they are maps, roadmaps for understanding life, for understanding the world around us. They may be idealized, exaggerated, quite often fictitious, but they give us a way with another tool with which to understand the world around us. And we can see the use of myth, or the central role of myth as a source of meaning for people, in lots and lots of products, systems, and services which we can find out there in the real world. For example, illustrated here, some Ray-Ban glasses. 1920s, the first time airplanes had engines powerful enough to get them systematically above the clouds, up above the clouds where the sun shines very bright and it's very difficult to see because of the glare. So people, companies, organizations, teams like Ray-Ban come out with products which can help to deal with the glare that the aviators are suffering above the clouds. In 2020, 2021, is the Ray-Ban glass something that's fully required of a person who's just going for a walk in the park? Probably not. Something that was a requirement for the aviator in 1920 is probably not a fundamental, practical, functional requirement of a person walking in the park today. However, the narrative of the aviator, the narrative of the product as a tool for addressing needs, for getting out, for winning the challenge that the aviator faced at the time, the story, the narrative, the myth provides a model, it provides a source of meaning and value, and purchasing or being part of that is somehow making us part of the story. It's somehow saying we share those values, or at least we respect them, and we're quite amazed by the people of the time. And to some degree, we're living, we wish to live, we aspire to live similar way our lives as those people did at the time. Very similar situation with cowboy boots. Very similar situation with many motorcycles, automobiles, and other vehicles, where we see that the aesthetics and some of the technical details and some of the materials that are used in the design are very close, if not exactly the same, as the racing versions that our heroes use on the racetrack on the Saturday afternoon, the Sunday afternoon, risking their lives going around the circuit. We see lots and lots of examples of products or clothing in the fashion industry and so forth, which are inspired from heroes from military history, such as the watch of the submarine crew that we see at the bottom of this image. We see lots of products and paraphernalias and clothing and fashion statements being made based on the heroes of the Hollywood movies or the heroes of the comic strips of our childhood. And on the top right-hand example, we see, for example, that it's not necessarily the case that every aspect of a design needs to draw from a mythical or heroic narrative. It can be a matter of even detailing. For example, this Ferrari road vehicle, we see at the right bottom corner the little selector lever for selecting the level of driving automation. The manettino, as it's called in Italian, is similar, if not identical, to the series of little selectors which is on the steering wheel of the Formula One race car of the Ferrari racing team. So perhaps this is not a Formula One car, but if you're a big fan of auto racing, particularly of Formula One, by purchasing one of these products, you can feel a little bit like your heroes who are racing around the track on a Sunday afternoon, because you have some of the same things in front of you that they are seeing in front of them on the Sunday afternoon. So buying into, connecting with, somehow relating to narratives and stories which people use to organize their lives is a very important consideration in many design settings, for many products and services. Now, is meaning, whether it's a highly functional, a more ritualistic facilitator meaning, or a story making sense of associating with meaning, is this meaning a universal? Is it scientific in nature? Is it 2 + 2 = 4? The short answer is no, it's not. The meaning depends on many things, and meanings change, and meanings need updating and reconsidering quite frequently in design, even during the course of a project. Sometimes events can occur in the world which requires the design team to stop for a second, look again at the meanings they're leveraging, and see if they're on the right track, or if something has changed in the meantime. So what do meanings depend on? One thing they depend on is the situation or scenario. For example, this little semiotic study from some years back is just an example. It's a simple little thing, but it's just to give the flavor, give the feeling for how meanings can change and what could be driving the change. In this case, we have a triangle, and this triangle on the left is being placed next to some other geometric forms. There was a study performed with a certain number of people, and when they asked the people, this thing on the left, this little shape, give me a sentence to describe it. If they show the three objects which are at the top, where it says the triangle, if that was all that was shown on the sheet of paper, not the rest of the image, just the triangle, the rectangle, and the polygon, if that's what was being shown, well, most people, or at least many people, answered that's the triangle. If instead they were shown the small triangle, the two large ones, the most typical thing that people stated in response to the question was the small one. If it was instead the large and the two small, the large one, the white one, the equilateral one, etc., etc. So I think you can see what's happening here, which is meaning is never a universal absolute. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. We're not talking about things floating in outer space. We're talking about the meanings of things which are in the real world, typically around us, part of some process with us, and maybe some of our friends or family members at the same time. Therefore, the things we notice when we look at it, and the things that we say about it, and quite often the mental model we form of it is very much a function, or at least it's influenced by, if nothing else, the background of everything else that's happening. So here you can see that a triangle isn't just a triangle. It can be any one of a number of things depending on the company it finds itself in. So meaning changes with background or context, or more precisely in design terms, it changes with scenario. Meaning can also change with culture. For example, this is a very popular, well-known design wheel showing in different parts of the world how colors may be interpreted differently, taken to mean different things. On this particular wheel, we have the A, B, C, D, and E. We have the Americas, we have Europe, we have parts of Asia. If you look carefully in detail around the image, you will see that the same concept or the same word in different parts of the globe will be associated most strongly with a different color. Classic example, red and green, how they might have slightly different connotations between Western Europe and China, for example. So this is a wheel which captures a large number of studies done in various parts of the world, and you see quite striking and quite dramatic differences in which colors are associated with which ideas, which human values, or which design characteristics. So there's no doubt that meanings, and in this case the example of color is just an example, but even the complete meaning of the artifact can change quite substantially with culture. So we have context, the place, the time, the culture, the group of people who happen to be doing it, possibly some economic and other contextual factors, possibly some other sociological drivers. Lots and lots of things can change the scenario and the way people are approaching it, and thus can slightly influence one way or the other the meaning. Meaning depends also on the people involved. It can also change quite substantially from person to person. For example, these are examples taken from the book that I mentioned previously by Csikszentmihalyi. Now, in these examples, these are the results of studies where these gentlemen went and they asked questions like, your house is catched on fire, you only have a minute to grab a few valuable items before you run out the door, the house will probably burn to the ground and everything will be destroyed. Which valuable items do you grab and take with you as you rush out the door? Or other questions they might have asked in different studies they performed. In your house, think of all the things that are in your house, all the things which are not actually part of the fabric of the building. Which of these are the most important to you, and rank them on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 or something of this nature about how important they are to you. So these are measures, possibly a bit more of value than the actual meaning, but since the two come almost hand in hand, they also imply to some degree the differences in meaning. So if we look at the kinds of results that were spread throughout that textbook, and lots of really lovely examples of this type, here's one example of how meanings and values were changing with nature. The most frequently named objects by the group of men and the group of women, 140 something, 170 something people, substantial number of people. If we look at what I've circled in the image, which is the photographs, the family photo album, we'll see that the men didn't list it in the way they answered. They didn't ended up giving very much priority to it. It's only 9th on the list, well below the TV set, the stereo, the books, the sports equipment, and so forth. Whereas if we look at the female participants, how they answered to the questions, the photographs rank quite high, number 2 on the list. So here we have value, certainly, that's the direct measure, but also by implication, changes in the meanings of the roles these artifacts play in people's lives. We can see substantial differences, non-negligible differences, as a function of gender. And similar differences can be noted also as a function of age. Similar sort of scenario, same people doing the research, taken from the same textbook, children, parents, grandparents. So basically roughly 3 generations of people within families. The photo album, the family pictures, where did they rank? With the young children, absolute bottom of the list. They'll take their toys, the TV, the stereo, these days the Nintendo, the iPad, and so forth. There's lots and lots of practical, functional tools which will go out the door if there's the emergency or be ranked as the most important things in their bedroom. The photos are certainly low on priority. The parents, the photos move quite substantially up the list. So the value and meaning of these memories captured in these photos are quite different for the parents, who are much older, than the young children who haven't really experienced much of life yet. And the grandparents, who have had a rich life and great experiences and so many challenges and obstacles to overcome in their life, the photos and the images to help remember these life experiences and these challenges and the many joys and distresses of their life, these images are very high on the list, number 1 with most people. So age and a person's, how much life experiences they've accumulated and how they approach looking at their life, given the life they've lived, that affects quite substantially the values and meanings of things. The photo albums just being a particularly obvious and blatant example of the situation. And meaning changes also with the passing of time. And this is a point that unfortunately is missed quite often in commercial practice. Many organizations have possibly not taken that much time to look at where their product, system, or service currently sits from a temporal point of view, because artifacts have a life trajectory just like people. Things enter the world with certain capabilities and fitting into people's lives in certain ways, and before they're technologically obsolete or obsolescent and exit this world, probably they've gone through an evolution and played different parts or occupied different roles in people's lives. If we look at what happens over time, we see a couple interesting and crisscrossing behaviors. Lots and lots of things, particularly technological things, lots of them enter this world, they enter our world as people, as tools, but not so much a practical everyday tool, certainly not for everybody. Possibly a better word is to say toys or luxuries. They enter the world as an oddity, as a new experience, as a new capability, often not affordable by the masses, but as they evolve technologically and are produced better and are more efficient and become cheaper and more available and more secure and easier to store and so forth and so on, as these products improve in quality, improve in functionality, and drop in price, they go in the direction of becoming a commodity. So things like what's shown here, the automobile, the road vehicle, lovely, typical, stereotypical example, enters the world as a bit of a toy for a very small number of people who can afford one. Most people don't even have a horse at this time, never mind a horseless carriage. What enters the world as a curiosity slowly becomes something that, hey, we all need one to get to work. And eventually it takes on the role it has today, which, yes, there are still sports cars and luxury vehicles which remained true to this initial set of expectations, but to a vast degree, the many millions of vehicles produced, a large amount of them, possibly the majority, are more of a commodity. It's more of getting from A to B, getting to work, taking the kids to the playground and so forth. They're not really the sorts of curiosities and luxuries they once were at the beginning. So there's a path from luxury, curiosity, possibly even toy, to almost pure commodity. There's another path in the opposite direction to some extent, which is something that starts out highly functional, possibly for large numbers of people and very similar and standardized, but as time progresses, the artifact takes on a much more personal, much more varied, much more luxury, much more toy-like use to it. And the classic example, lovely stereotypical example described by Pullin in his lovely book on Design Meets Disability of 2009, the eyeglasses. Lenses, for purposes of amplification, are not new to society. In antiquity, lenses existed, not so many, but there were some, and they were kept in your pocket, in your hand. When you needed it, you might pull out your little lens at the market and look at something. But in Greek or Roman times, you would not walk around with anything or use it too often, because weakness of vision would have been considered in antiquity to be an illness, to be a sickness, to be a disease. The other guy sees very clearly, your vision's not so good. So it would have had social stigma associated with it. So it would have been downplayed. It isn't that you didn't have lenses, but it wouldn't have been used as commonly. But as time passed, the medieval, the Renaissance, we start to see lots of eyeglasses and eyewears being produced. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, we are now producing vast quantities of eyewears at very reasonable cost that more and more people can afford and correct their vision with. And we get to the point that it's now something that everyone has one. Most families, someone has glasses, so the glasses start to be made in different colors and different shapes and different sizes, and people start to personalize because there's too many of these devices out there. They need more of a personal touch. As they become more personalized, they get involved in the world of fashion, they get involved in social trends, they start to be facilitators or expressors of personal character and personal lifestyle and personal values, and they come to where we are today, which on the streets of London, lots and lots of people are wearing frames with no lenses in them, because the frame is a pure fashion statement. Having a frame of a certain shape and a certain color made of a certain material with a certain logic to it is a form of personal expression. So we have lots and lots of examples in large cities such as London of people walking around with frames, with no lenses, and no corrective ability, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with their eyesight. This is performing a very different semiotic social function. So we have a direction of it's a toy, it's a tool, it's a form of expression, becomes commoditized with vehicles, for example. And we have another direction, which is it was commoditized and it was very common, and slowly families evolved of this product to permit personalization and personal expression, and it's going in a direction of art and curiosities and luxury as opposed to pure commodity. Meaning is also ideological. So if we can understand why it's important, what are the three main types, how it might change with people, settings, time, and other factors, then there's other questions about, in design, how does this fit into my design process? Where is it that I have to consider it? Well, it's important to consider that there's a strict connection, there's a quite tight connection between meaning and ideology. Ideology being a set of beliefs, a system of beliefs, a value system. When ideologies exist in certain fields and products or systems or services are part of that, and they may or may not take up that ideology given that that occurs in that setting, it's important to consider which ideology as a designer you're taking on board and whether you have the right meaning for that, and then if you're getting the right product to address that. From ideology point of view, the world today is full of products and services which are highly ideological in their marketing, their branding, possibly quite frequently also within, in many cases, their internal company or organizational arrangements. For example, a commercial ideology, not a political one, not a social one, but an example of a purely commercial one. Designing based on ideology, combative soul with willpower of Nike. Nike for a long time has had TV commercials, has designed products, has produced products, has set their price points, looked at their company touch points, all of this from a very focused perspective. And for a long time the message was the myth of just do it. Overcome societal discrimination through sport. Yes, you may not be wealthy. Yes, you may be disadvantaged in many ways. Yes, society is unfair. But through sports and through implicitly the use of good sports tools such as those of Nike, you can express yourself, you can be successful, you can get ahead despite all of the obstacles and all of the barriers. So as a commercial or marketing approach, there's a ideology behind it, and the design of the artifact and the various touch points with the business are typically optimized to be consistent with that particular ideology. Another aspect about meaning that's important to remember for designers, meaning is metaphorical. What do we mean by metaphor? Metaphors are figures of speech or actions or things or situations where one object, usually a complicated or less familiar or not easy to grasp concept, is expressed or talked about in terms of another concept, which is usually simpler in some way or much more familiar because it's been around longer, or it's much more relevant to the group of people that your product or your service is directed to. So metaphor is a system of ideas. Many people would argue that all human thought processes and neuroscience, quite often their measures, seems to find things which seem to be in part in support of that position. All human thinking processes are claimed by some to be metaphorical in nature. Metaphor being when you think dog or cat, you bring with the word many, many different characteristics. Has 4 legs, has a tail, has whiskers, 2 eyes, good to know, smells things very much better than us, and so forth and so on. Metaphor means bringing all those details with something, with an idea, with an object, with a word or a name. And metaphor is incredibly fundamental in design. For example, many examples could be cited, just one to give the idea a little bit of just how drastic it can be, the importance of it. If we look at a product such as bottled water, a very simple everyday staple, changing the metaphor by changing the design permits us to completely change also the cost point, the business model, the logistics of the organization, and so forth. For example, on the right, we have a bottle of water in a plastic simple bottle with a basic label. At most stores, most food stores, that's something that costs in the United Kingdom around £1. The same amount of water in a slightly better design, more luxurious, more aesthetically pleasing container is now passing from it being water to a table decoration, because the bottle can be reused and even when it's just used in its basic purpose, leaving that sitting on your desk at work can be used to send a message about your preferences in food and drink, about your lifestyle, about what you feel about healthy living, and so forth. So changing the metaphor for basically the same thing, a liter of water, completely changes the nature of the business, completely changes the names you put on the labels, completely changes how much you can ask for the product. So metaphor is incredibly fundamental, because given physical artifacts are not necessarily constrained to one or only one or two metaphors. There can be multiple metaphors or ways of thinking, talking, discussing, connecting, ways of parameters that come with the concept. There can be multiple available for the same thing you're trying to design, and choosing which of them is more appropriate for your target audience and your target setting is incredibly important. So, what's the big picture at the end of all this? Design for meaning is, of course, a very complex matter. There's a lot of considerations, and we've only introduced some of the more critical and important ones. They're all things that are worth discussing at some point, at least to some degree, over the course of a design project. And it's very important, possibly at the beginning of a design process, to clarify a couple of basic decisions about the route that will be taken and the design process which will be performed for that particular design brief for that particular client. Decisions that need taking. First of all, which ideology are we dealing with here? The client who set the brief. What is their implicit or explicit corporate ideology? The local government agency which set the brief for the design for the artifact in the community. What is the specific emphasis of that local community organization or that governmental agency? What is the ideology? Because that's the starting point to make sure that all the meanings are fully compatible with that particular ideology. Second critical decision, extremely important. Are we leveraging a pre-existing meaning, or are we creating a new one? Classic example from the motor industry. Are we making an automobile in the sense of a petrol or diesel automobile as we knew it in the 20th century? Or are we making an electric vehicle, and an electric vehicle, due to the change in the technology and the change in society since the 20th century, are we talking about something very different? And it should look very different, it should behave very different, and it should fulfill a different set of needs for its customers. So are we going to work within the bounds of a pre-existing meaning and try to optimize and target and do a very good job leveraging ideas, words, colors, parameters that are out there? Or are we going to be intentionally disruptive and breaking the mold a bit and possibly going for some extreme differences, so as to emphasize the fact that you shouldn't be thinking about this as a taxi driven by a person. You should be thinking of this as an autonomous vehicle, which is actually a slightly different thing from a taxi service, even though they can both be called from an app and they both have similar costs and they both have certain characteristics of the vehicle in common. So deciding the ideology, deciding whether we're leveraging or trying to create a new icon, a new meaning, a new word, a new way of thinking, fundamental decision at the beginning of the process. Once we've made those decisions, we have to decide, is our artifact following mostly a functional meaning, a ritual meaning, or a mythical meaning? Which of those is most key? A heritage brand, your Bentleys, your Armanis, and so forth. Possibly the myth, the narrative, the story associating with a group of people or a time in history or some sort of value system might be the key. If instead it's a new meaning, we have to spend some effort as designers at what I would refer to as meaningfication. We have to put in place with the product and with its communication and its touch points all the support necessary to help people to see that this is something new and that it has these characteristics for these reasons. Meaningfication doesn't instantaneously happen just by launching something onto the market or providing something to the local community. It needs constructing, it needs supporting. And then, of course, there's the question of having gotten that far and clarified at a concept design stage some of these points and having perhaps even agreed some of them with the client who set the brief, we then have to lock in definitively into a specific metaphor, either existing or new, and we have to make sure all the details of the design are consistent. The buttons need to be consistent with that metaphor. The colors need to be the way we talk about, the name we give it, the functions that show up on the screen, the way it talks to us. Everything must be consistent with that metaphor. If it's sustainable, environmental, everything must be green, everything must be clear, it's saving energy, everything. If instead it's about pleasure and enjoyment, every aspect of it must be reinforcing the tactile, acoustic, the social and the other pleasures that can come from that particular artifact. And then finally, if we can get through this and get some agreements and decisions and come with some thoughts about which paths we're taking, then there's all the design work to do. There's all the concept sketching, the technology scoping, the manufacturing and the cost estimating. There's a lot of hard work at that point still to be done, but at least we're getting we're starting embarking on that design work, knowing that we have a consistent, logical agreement or approach for what we're trying to achieve for the people this is destined for. So from that point on, perhaps the majority of the work is still to come, but at least the work is worth doing because we have a fairly clear idea of how this is going to have meaning and how it might impact the lives of the people it's directed to. So that's the end of this talk. Thank you so much for your time and patience with this. I hope that some of the definitions and concepts and a few of the examples were of some relevance to you in your everyday life and hopefully at your work or your study. And we'll be speaking with you again on the next occasion. Thank you very much.